Hey, everybody. Today we are going to be discussing Nassim Taleb's book, Antifragile. It's part of a whole series, an essay that I think he described it, on probability and how we fool ourselves into believing that we can predict the future. We can predict massive events that have a very small likelihood of ever being predicted, and how as humans, we can actually move into a realm of being able to face risks and take risks in a way that's intelligent. And throughout the book, he criticizes, the book is a critique, a social critique. It's also an extremely fascinating intellectual endeavor in that he maps out this big gap that we have as a species, it seems. I think that he went through all the languages and found that no language really had a suitable antonym for the word fragile. Like I think in his interviews, he describes you get a box and you put glass in it. You're shipping glass to somebody overseas, and you put fragile on it. But we don't have anything that you would put likes disorder on it. Like, please shake this box. We don't have any word. And so he came up with a word, and it's the title of the book, Antifragile. Obviously, he's also the author of The Black Swan and
Skin in the Game.
Procrustes,
The Bed of Procrustes.
The Bed of Procrustes, which is just a lot of aphorisms, very witty and poignant. He's a very intelligent and very interesting, exotic thinker.
Mm-hmm. Also, Fooled by Randomness I think that was the first book in this series that he wrote. He had Fooled by Randomness, then Black Swan, then this one, Antifragile, and then Skin in the Game, and then Bed of Procrustes was somewhere in there. Mm-hmm. One comment on that phenomenon of language that he observes in the book, just to get a bit more into the definitions. So if you look at the word fragile, it's something that you want to avoid any stressors coming in contact with a fragile thing. So if you think about like a small glass ornament or something very intricate, you want to put it in a glass case or something. You don't want kids to be around it. You don't want them to be playing with it because a small knock or a drop will break it, and break it beyond repair most often. That's what a fragile thing is. That's like why you say we put fragile on boxes. But what's the opposite of fragile? So he points out that practically in every conversation, if you ask someone who isn't already familiar with the term, they'll say that the opposite of fragile is robust or resilient. So something that will withstand shocks and not break because of them. But that's not the case, because for something fragile, something fragile doesn't like stressors, doesn't like chaos or volatility or randomness. It wants to be shielded from those things. But something that's robust, like a rock or a steel block, those things, they can withstand shocks. You can take a hammer to them, oftentimes without breaking them, or their toleration of stressors is very high, so it takes a lot of effort in order to destroy them. But they don't like stressors. They don't gain from those kinds of events, that kind of chaos. So the opposite of fragile is something that, like you said, actually gains something from a stressor. And that's not what robust is. Robust is neutral. So you've got something like fragile, which is negative. It doesn't like something. And you've got neutral, robust things, which can go either way. It's like you can hit them or you cannot hit them, but it doesn't matter to the robust thing. Then you've got this other category of things which actually benefit from disorder, benefit from stress and chaos to some degree. And we don't have a word for that, or we didn't until Taleb came along. But the point that he makes is that even if we lack a word for it, we understand it, and humans have always understood it, even if they didn't have the words for it. So along those lines, he gives another example just to kind of give the concept of this ability to do without knowing. Because humans can do a lot of things without necessarily knowing why or why they do them or why it works, how it works. And one example that he gives is the names of colors. So in the typical rainbow, in our culture, it's got 7 colors. red, orange, yellow, green, blue, indigo, violet. But he gives the example of some research that shows that there are some cultures, some tribes, or I can't remember who exactly, that only have 3 colors, for instance. And then there's the now famous phenomenon from ancient Greek literature that shows that they didn't have a word for blue, for instance. They had a very limited range of color words. And so some people, at the time this was discovered, I think that it was in the 1800s, the first guy that really observed this. Mm-hmm. Because like if you look at Homer, for instance, in the Odyssey, the sea is described as the wine dark sea. And there's no word for blue. There's no word for the blue sky or blue water, which is very strange. There's like light colors and dark colors, and then a few in between, like maybe yellow or something like that. But there weren't necessarily all these different colors. But so the idea when this was first really popularized was that maybe human vision had evolved since then, that we couldn't actually see blue back then. We didn't have the ability to see that color. And it's only been in the last couple thousand years that we've developed the ability to actually see blue. Well, that's actually, it's probably nonsense. What is actually the case is that those like modern cultures that only see 3 colors, for instance, they have 3 names for colors. But that doesn't mean they can't distinguish between all the existing colors. If you show them, if they have no word for blue and you show them blue or 2 blue things, they'll be able to match the 2 blue things compared to the 2 green things, the 2 orange things, whatever. It's just that they don't have the word for it. They can act it out and they can recognize they can distinguish and differentiate between those, but just not name them according to the our 7 color convention. And for me, for instance, like I only ever use 6 colors. I never really understood, indigo, violet. It's like it's blue or it's purple. Like I don't see. I can't. If there's I've done color perception tests, right, where you match up colors, and I've got I always score really high on them. I can distinguish shades of different colors. But if you ask me, what indigo is, I'll just say, well, show me a color. It's either blue or it's purple. Mm-hmm. So I've got 6 basic colors that I work with, and then, maybe, I can distinguish, or I can name some shades like cyan blue, for instance, or something like that. But the words kind of don't matter. Well, they do matter in a sense, but in the practical realm, they don't really matter because we can still act these things out and still recognize them. So some of the principles of anti-fragility have been known, well, just as long as humans. We tend to understand that living things have this property, even though we haven't had a name for it, and we act in a way that acknowledges the existence of this kind of thing, this property. We also do things totally ignorantly against this property by kind of imposing our own beliefs about the nature of things in reality that actually produce fragility. Mm-hmm. Because by not recognizing things as anti-fragile, we actually produce fragility. We make things more at risk of falling apart.
Yes. Well, so Taleb is a kind of a financial analyst. He used to be a trader. He's a kind of a self-stylized philosopher. And so one of the anecdotes, and by the way, this is a very funny book. Taleb sprinkles a lot of his explanations with personal experience, analogies, metaphors. So this isn't a kind of a dry intellectual exercise for him. He's really quite entertaining. But one of the things that kind of spurred him on, like you were saying, Harrison, he's seeing all of this tendency in society and culture and Western thinking in inducing fragility where it's actually harmful and unnecessary. And so he was at a kind of a economic conference where a forecaster was giving his predictions for the economy of, I think, either Japan or Korea, and predicting the projections for the next 5 years. So Taleb, in a burst of uncontrollable anger and emotion, rushes to the stage and says, to everyone, basically, stop predicting things and foisting this information on people that are so reliant and vulnerable to this information that you can't possibly know with all the variables involved. And by the way, have you seen this guy's predictions for the past 5 years or 3 years? Is he a reliable source of information for past years? So all of this is born out of his own kind of authentic thinking through of the problems of the types of information that people are getting and their ability to problem solve and kind of think forward through their own process of navigating their own issues on a in multiple spheres. So he gets into one of his biggest focuses is in economics and business and finance. He'll look at, for instance, and mention quite a number of times the economic recession of 2008 and how everyone says, oh, we couldn't possibly foresee this thing coming about. And people mistaking the causes for these types of events for their real underlying issues. So he wants to help people. He wants people to realize that we've been inculcated with an idea that we need to be protected from the small stuff when there are much larger black swans or novel developments or revolutionary developments in the life of an individual, as Jordan Peterson would say, that that one can take account for in a certain number of ways. And one of the points he makes early on in the book is that individuals are quite familiar with the idea of post-traumatic stress. But in fact, there is such a thing as post-traumatic growth, that there are stressors and events that, as Nietzsche would say, would make us stronger if it doesn't kill you, that we can make lemonade out of from lemons. So that's a lot of the kind of angle that he's coming in on and trying to impart to people who seem overly risk adverse, overly protective of their of various things. The helicopter parent, for instance, would be one analogy that we could see in parenting. The kind of overprotective parent who doesn't allow their child to learn from mistakes or get injured from time to time, where these smaller, kind of more manageable injuries would assist someone in growing and becoming stronger and learning and possibly applying, their mistake and their pain towards a much larger area in their lives where they might be vulnerable to injury.
And I think this is where we have a good tie-in for previous shows in our discussion on Jordan B. Peterson's maps of meaning and the known and the unknown, and all the different ways that our society has come to understand and map out the world, and how, to a large extent, we've kind of ruled out mythology. We've ruled out the realm of action as being a legitimate area of study, and it's mostly, like he describes it, as like these Soviet Harvard fragilistas who think that everything can be analyzed and you can understand and predicted and controlled. And what he set out to do with these tomes of books, it seems, is to give a map of meaning essentially to the rest of us living in a world that, I mean, just every day you're bombarded. All of us are bombarded by new predictions, all sorts of, climate change predictions, economic collapse, viral infections. every day there's some sort of something big, crazy is going to happen. And as he says, we can spend our entire lives trying to predict the future with absolute certainty, and that is not going to work. It's not a method that we can actually, utilize. We're never going to be able to statistically prophesize the end of the universe or tomorrow even. But what we can do is we can put ourselves in a position where we can measure our fragility and our anti-fragility in a specific scenario. So if you have more upswing or upside than downside when exposed to a certain stress, any sort of certain, calamity, you are in a position to be anti-fragile. For example, you take, like those preppers. They have, let's say they have cans of food, and there's this massive cataclysm. And now all of a sudden they are sitting on gold, essentially, because this food is now gold to them. They can eat, they can survive, or whatever. And so in that situation, those individuals are anti-fragile. Their upside is substantially increased by their own activities. And you can do this. He has a number of different heuristics that you can implement in order to do that basically in your entire life. You can prepare for any kind of you can be proactive, basically, is what it is. You don't live in fear. You don't live with predictions like on this day this is going to happen or this is guaranteed to happen. We can't possibly. It makes us more fragile, actually. I think you would say, in order to live in such a way where you're going by people's predictions, often flawed predictions, and black swans are by definition unpredictable. Right. And so those are the things. But those are the things that scare us the most. Are those big events that are going to occur, but you can't capture them with any statistical sense of certainty. But that it's going to happen because it's happened in the past. You've had, World War II. You've had the 2008 climate crisis. You've had cometary bombardments of the planet. You know that there are these huge events that he terms black swans, which is almost a little bit too friendly, for the kind of ferocity and kind of damage that they inflict. But that is just one aspect of his whole argument. This book really builds on all the previous books. He lays out the reasons why black swans aren't predictable and how we kind of fool ourselves by thinking that we can predict them. And instead, we need to start seeing the world of action. In the world of action, we humans and most biological systems require some degree of stress and volatility in order to survive, just to live. It's just a biological fact that our bodies need stress in order to live.
Mm-hmm. But it's a certain type of stress, right? He makes that distinction because, he makes a lot of distinctions because things that are anti-fragile in one sense will be fragile in another. So it's really multi-layered and kind of contextual. So, for instance, any individual representative of a species, for instance, can be fragile in comparison to the species, and the species can be anti-fragile in comparison to the individual, because the individual can be, is vulnerable. It can die in innumerable, horrendous ways, mm-hmm. But that actually has an advantage at the species level or at the whole life system level. So there are distinctions like that. And so when it comes to stress, there are certain kinds of stress that organisms need, and then certain kinds of stress that are completely toxic. So, for example, he gives the example of office, the whole office climate, working at this monotonous task with a bad boss, and just the entire kind of city life thing creates all these stresses that actually make us sick and die, essentially. But we need stresses of a different kind, and he's very kind of pro paleo in a lot of ways. So, for instance, he doesn't like gyms, and the reason he gives is that gyms are completely artificial. So you have all these workout machines, for instance, where if you're on one of those fake bicycles or a treadmill or something. You're running or doing these repetitive movements where each one is exactly the same. Whereas in nature, every step you take is different. So you're constantly encountering this randomness in your environment, and so every step you take affects your foot and your leg and your body in a different way. And the most natural ways of kind of encountering the most natural way of working out, for instance, isn't so routine and rigid and systematized. It's very much, well, it's more natural. It's like you go out into the forest and you lift up a rock or a tree or something. You don't have barbells in the forest, for instance. But so that's one kind of stressor that is beneficial for the body. Talks about even just working out when you're stressing your body. You're harming your body. You're exposing it to a stress and a threat of some sort. You're doing damage to your body, and then your body, in response, overcompensates. It says, "Okay, I'm going to prepare for this for the next time, but I'm going to overcompensate. I'm going to push a little bit harder, so that not only will I be able to handle that same stressor that I was exposed to, but I'll be able to handle a bigger stressor." So you actually grow strength, and you actually grow strength in that way. You become stronger and able to kind of conquer bigger obstacles than you were in the past. So those are the kind of stresses. Well, it's one kind of stress that actually increases your performance because of that overcompensation. He gives a funny example of just the poor use of prediction. For instance, when designing, let's say, a dam or something, or anything to do with flooding. Yeah, it was to do with flooding. So you have these planners that look in the past 100 years and pick the biggest flood that they had in the past 100 years, and they plan for that level, not realizing or not thinking that previous flood was out of the ordinary. If the planners of that time had used the previous biggest flood, they wouldn't have been prepared for the one that was coming up. You have to prepare for more than has been experienced because, like you say, you can't predict black swans. It's not like there's this artificial limit for flooding that says, oh, this is the most it's ever going to flood because that's what happened 100 years ago or 200 years ago. No, that one was out of the ordinary. That's the reason it's the one that you look back on. So you have to plan for the unimaginable, plan for the one you can't predict. So you plan for a flood of much greater proportions than has ever been experienced, because chances are that's the one. Well, chances are that's the one that's the one that, if it happens, will really set you back. So, yeah.
Well, that kind of reminds me about his point on centralization and his look at the way that Switzerland functions, because what Taleb would say is that the decentralization of Switzerland that has these various kind of regional governments that very lightly govern, but that manage to take care of all of the considerations of a given area fairly productively, make it more or less robust and less vulnerable to the systemic issues or problems that a very centralized state would have with a very big authoritarian government that might otherwise make bad decisions that affect everybody. Mm-hmm. So he's a strong proponent for decentralization, where you have this kind of autonomous, if it ain't broke, don't fix it, essentially. And there are so many points that he makes. The thing is, when I was reading this book, he kept qualifying all of his ideas for what being anti-fragile was. He makes, like you said, Harrison, he makes these, he contextualizes this idea, and he applies it into many spheres. And something that I really enjoyed about it was he's beseeching his readers to get out of domain dependence or this kind of narrow thinking. You might actually enjoy some amount of anti-fragility in your own life. You might kind of unwittingly or even consciously or intuitively understand how something works and make the best use of it at your job, or even just the economics of spending energy and being productive at home if you're at home. But he says that these are concepts that you can apply towards any sphere of your life, towards the future, in such a way that you are less vulnerable to those black swans or events that would seek to or that would somehow make you more vulnerable to certain stressors.
Right, and then even in the event of a debilitating event like a black swan, something like a negative black swan, you could possibly gain from it. But there's also positive black swans that you can, kind of hunt down and track. And he uses he has the barbell to think about. He says use the barbell strategy. So the barbell is clearly, there's no middle ground. It's just all like you're very aggressive, but you're also very paranoid. So an example would be, like 15 years ago, let's say that you have a decent job, you are renting someplace, you can afford all your bills, you've got enough money that you can put into savings, and you hear about Bitcoin. Right? Now, if you're super, aggressive at the time, they're like, this is going to be the cryptocurrency, blah, blah, blah. And you're in on this stuff. Friend told you about it. And if you're super aggressive, but not paranoid, and you're not applying the anti-fragile philosophy, then you invest a ton of money into it, just a ton of money, and nothing happens. It's just years and years and years. And it's you don't see any real payoff. Your life just goes out of control. You forget your password. You end up doing drugs on But the barbell approach is to be super aggressive, but also be paranoid. So what you would do is, you have like 90% of your savings in some very conservative spot,
right,
and then you take 10% and you invest that into this very exotic thing. And if there's massive upswing, then you are all benefit. But if there's any downside to it, then you are still robust. You're still not going to be, shaken to your core. And it's just a matter of course. He basically advises hunting, like being a participant, a willing participant in life, that you're going out and you're seeking these kinds of things, and you're being strategic about it, and you're living life in a relatively, heroic way. Because in one of his books, he writes that, if you don't have a heroic bent by your 30s, you've started to die already.
Well, a couple things on that. I want to get back to the heroes just because it reminded me of a passage in this book, but the example you gave of saving 90% and kind of being risky with the 10% is that's an example also of skin in the game. So that's an example of a person who has their own skin in the game, because they're investing their own money basically and taking a risk for themselves. But one of the things that he's one of his big focuses and one of his big pet peeves is too small a word for it. One of the things that that gets his blood boiling, and you can see this on Twitter, is people who not only don't have skin in the game, but have other people's skin in the game. And that's one of the reasons he hates big governments and centralized governments, is because they're all other people's skin in the game. Mm-hmm. Because there's no potential bad consequence for those individuals. It's all someone else. So in the financial world, it's investing other people's money in risky endeavors, and then not having to pay any consequences for losing other people's money. So, and as a trader, he didn't like, whenever he saw this, he didn't like it. He personally took the approach of only recommending investments that he himself was invested in and would invest for himself, so that if something bad happened, he would suffer along with, the people that he had recommended these financial moves to. So that's a thing about having skin in the game, is that's kind of a central aspect of morality or character. Mm-hmm. And so this reminds me of, this is the quote that reminded me of. He just mentions heroes, because he talks about heroes in skin in the game too. But he points out that As we discovered during the financial crisis that started in 2008, these blow-up risks to others are easily concealed owing to the growing complexity of modern institutions and political affairs. While in the past, people of rank or status were those and only those who took risks, who had the downside for their actions, and heroes were those who did so for the sake of others, today the exact reverse is taking place. We are witnessing the rise of a new class of inverse heroes, that is, bureaucrats, bankers, Davos-attending members of the IAND, International Association of Name Droppers, and academics with too much power and no real downside or accountability. They game the system while citizens pay the price. At no point in history have so many non-risk takers, that is, with no personal exposure, exerted so much control. The chief ethical rule is the following: thou shalt not have antifragility at the expense of the fragility of others. That's kind of one of his core, ethical positions that shows itself in all his books. And just a bit on Taleb, like I mentioned, if you see him on Twitter, he's quite pugnacious, I think. Like, if you read his Twitter, he's constantly calling people out and swearing at them and insulting people. But the thing about him is that he's only insulting people, for the most part, as far as I've been able to tell, that kind of deserve to be called out and insulted. It's like if you look at the people that he attacks, he doesn't like frauds. He doesn't like bankers, like in this quote, bankers, bureaucrats, Monsanto, interventionists in foreign policy matters. Most of his targets pretty much deserve it, and so he's coming from a position where he's got what he calls like FU money, in the sense that he's not beholden to anyone. So that's a big thing about him is his definition of freedom. And like he points out, if you're working in a corporation, you don't have very much freedom. You're pretty much a slave. And in his, like, when you're self-employed, for instance, you have a lot more freedom. Or if you're he says in this book, he argues that a cab driver has more freedom than a business executive or a CEO, because they can weather certain stressors, and they can quit if they come up against, like, it's kind of like the whistleblower mentality. Like, if something's happening that you don't agree with, well, a cab driver can just quit and find another job. Someone who's entrenched in an institution doesn't have that freedom. There's all kinds of institutional and emotional considerations that come in to prevent someone from actually taking a heroic action. So with FU money, that's money that you can use to kind of shield yourself from the attacks of others for your own heroic action. Unfortunately, a lot of people don't have FU money, or if they do, don't use it for a noble purpose. So just back to Taleb. So he's relentless in his vituperation of people he sees as just completely unethical, and those who produce more harm for other people than they do for themselves, and who actively structured their lives in order to put the harm onto other people and to avoid it for themselves. And just as an example of the kind of humorous way that he takes down people like this, I want to read this paragraph. So, and for those who think that academia is quieter and an emotionally relaxing transition after the volatile and risk-taking business life, a surprise. When in action, new problems and scares emerge every day to displace and eliminate the previous day's headaches, resentments, and conflicts. A nail displaces another nail with astonishing variety. But academics, particularly in social science, seem to distrust each other. They live in petty obsessions, envy, and icy cold hatreds, with small clubs, with small snubs developing into grudges, fossilized over time in the loneliness of the transaction with the computer screen and the immutability of their environment. Not to mention a level of envy I have almost never seen in business. My experience is that money and transactions purify relations. Ideas and abstract matters like recognition and credit warp them, creating an atmosphere of perpetual rivalry. I grew to find people greedy for credentials nauseating, repulsive, and untrustworthy. Commerce, business, Levantine souks, though not large-scale markets and corporations, are activities and places that bring out the best in people, making most of them forgiving, honest, loving, trusting, and open-minded. As a member of the Christian minority in the Near East, I can vouch that commerce, particularly small commerce, is the door to tolerance, the only door, in my opinion, to any form of tolerance. It beats rationalizations and lectures. Like antifragile tinkering, mistakes are small and rapidly forgotten. So that is, again, an encapsulation of this idea of decentralization and the scale of systems. Like, he's the guy that said, I quoted it on a different show when he's talking about political systems. He's all about scale. So things that will work on one scale won't work in other scales. So he often says, for instance, that he for president, he votes libertarian. State level, he votes Republican. County level, he votes Democrat. And then, like, city level, he votes like socialist, and then in his family he's communist. So there's things that like that there's things that work on certain levels that don't work on higher levels, like I just said. So for the village-based kind of community, it's very decentralized. It's to have a close-knit community or village, and then and to give that as much independence as possible, because that's where things work. That's where the people you actually interact with are. And when you're so far away from a distant central authority, that central authority has no familiarity with you. There's no connection. It's a totally distant relationship. So what does that person, what does that group, what does that institution know about your community, your village, and what will they actually do for you? Well, chances are not very much. And that's kind of what history shows, is that big central governments don't really care much about the tiny villages. They're doing their own thing with their own purposes, and it's the people that are actually living in the village that are concerned about their local concerns. And so in like a monarchist system, it would be the people that appeal to the monarch, to the king, to actually get the central government, in essence, to do something for them. But so the king was kind of a person acting on behalf of the little people. But you don't get that very often in central governments, and the central government necessitates that kind of system because it's not decentralized. If you just cut that out of the equation, and like I think he'd prefer going back to like the Greek system of independent city states, to have it as local and manageable as possible, and then to interact with other city states on that level. Incidentally, that's what he's kind of arguing for in the recent Lebanon crisis, because he's Lebanese, and so he's been talking with a lot of people in Lebanon and telling them just how acknowledging how idiotic their system has been, and how much of a just a pain in the ass the central government has been in Lebanon, and how little good that they've done, and how much massive fraud and corruption and mismanagement and incompetence, ineptitude they're responsible for. So that's just a little bit about Taleb himself and how he applies it. Just one other thing, he talks about in the book how everything that he writes about, and he makes it a point to do this, is everything he writes about is something that's come from his personal experience. And he said he's like, for example, he says he'd be guilty if he were to have to go to the library and do research to make a point in the book, because that would be false. All the things he writes about are things that he was actually interested in, and so doesn't need to go and find the source for it. And it's like, oh, well, and that's what really annoys me about academic work, is that when you're reading academic books, you can tell that these people are doing it. They just the way they write, and then the way they set up their footnotes. It's like, oh, this is how Alan Dershowitz did it. There was a scandal, back in the day when he wrote one of his books, and then found a manuscript where he's telling his research assistants, oh, find the source for this, and find find how you can support this point. And academics do that all the time. It's just like they have a point, and then oh, I'm going to look through the research literature and then see if there's something here I can use to support my point. It's like it's just it's pretty pathetic, I think. Whereas at least a guy like Taleb has some individuality and skin in the game. Yeah, well, if you're interested in something, you learn on it. You learn it because you are interested in learning it, and it becomes part of you. And then you can speak about it from yourself, especially if it's from experience. And that's what comes out of it. And you can see it in the result, because he is a character, right? He's not like anyone else. He's one of those few people in the I don't know if you'd call it like the academic world, because I don't think he'd like being considered an academic, but in the realm of thinkers, he's one of those few that actually have their own individuality, and you can tell it by reading it. Like he's got his own style, and it's not only interesting and enlightening, it's actually entertaining to read as well, and that's because of the way he's written, because of the way he writes, and because of the kind of principles that guide him in his writing. Just a little bit about
Right. He is really scathing in his rebuke of a lot of academics, and I think a lot of it is because of that fraudulent element that you're discussing, as this amount of hubris and self-serving entitlement that kind of goes into a lot of these bigwig academics, because clearly he admires intellectuals, he admires the intellect. He just doesn't like fraud. You know, that's the one example that he provides is of this financial guru, who, you know, some economist at Yale, who wrote all of these, you know, these arcane texts about probability and statistics and how to, you know, hedge your bets and all of this stuff. And then when the guy was, you know, he had this opportunity to take a different job at Harvard, and one of his colleagues was like, you know, he didn't know what to do, and one of his colleagues was like, well, why don't you just use the, you know, all of the statistics and everything that you've been using for years, you know, to predict all of these different things. And then the guy said, hey, come on, now this is serious.
Right.
And now it's my paycheck on the line. This is serious. I can't use that stuff. I just made it all up. I don't know if it actually works. You know, it's that level of fraudulence that you can tell. It just, like you said, it boils his blood, and that's why it's so funny and it's so refreshing to read Taleb's work, is because he's just at their throats, and that's why he even devotes a part of his book to why he had to become a bodybuilder, was because he was getting so many death threats after he, you know, successfully predicted the 2008 crash, and then went out and started, you know, just dropping names and all that stuff. He became a bodybuilder.
Well, that reminds me of another story that he gives about a very famous scientist that he's friendly with. And he becomes intimate with a lot of different types of characters, established book writers, this famous scientist that he doesn't name, individuals who are in the working class. He's a real student of nature and character, and that really comes across. But what he says about this the scientist is that every week the guy looks at information that's being said or not said about him. So the half of his work is not necessarily the research into science, into his field, but kind of protecting his reputation. You know, why wasn't this other scientist acknowledging my accomplishments when he got an award? Why is my name not being mentioned in this new study that's come out? So there's this incredible amount of energy and emotion that Taleb sees as fragile, as unnecessarily self-important and weak, that he'll get into when he discusses the Stoics and the works of Seneca, for instance, who took an approach that was much more at the very least robust, but not weak in a self-important way, and not kind of vulnerable to the the slings and arrows of ego trampling information or rumor. So he's really wonderful that way. You get a sense that he knows himself, and he's unapologetic for his points of view, because they're learned. They come of hard-earned experience. But I wanted to get back to an earlier analogy of this taxi driver as an example of a anti-fragile individual in the kind of more mundane sense of being a worker. So Taleb gives this example. He compares the taxi driver to this kind of personnel manager who has a very stable existence in a government or a kind of an established corporate atmosphere for many decades. And when it's seen that his position is no longer needed, or there are cutbacks due to centralization in a particular government, he finds himself in his mid-50s as a middle manager, completely vulnerable and fragile when he's let go, where the taxi driver, who essentially works for himself and may have periods of ups and downs, and may on the surface have this position or job that seems to be fragile, is actually more stable, because he's already kind of learned the ropes for himself of exactly how much he has to do and where he has to go to make his buck, farming people from one side of town to the other. So another point that's being made here, which I think is quite useful, is, on the surface of things, what may seem to be quite stable for us from the day-to-day, predictable, mundane, routine, is actually, in the long run, can be quite fragile and subject to the black swans that we mentioned a little earlier, where finding a more kind of independent, self-reliant route in one's thinking, in one's doing, in one's making a living, in one's relationships, affords a person this, the possibility for a greater amount of, muscle, a greater amount of will exercised in directions based on one's own thinking and being. So that was really quite interesting to me as an analogy, because most of us, let's face it, we're stuck in these kind of very 9-to-5 routine positions for lack of the knowledge or the impetus to strike out on our own in some way, for fear that it's riskier. And Taleb is saying, no, it may only seem riskier on the surface of things, because it's uncharted territory, because you're kind of relying more on your wits to engage in the environment, engage with other people, engage with your own capacity. So that was another really interesting part of the book, I thought.
Yeah, like the example with the French authors, that a lot of them would just get jobs as waiters, and so this is the kind of the barbell strategy. They have that job as a waiter. They just leave it. Or there were waiters, and then there were other like diplomats or sinecure, which was some kind of a French official or something, just very low level. You go to work, you just leave it there, you come back home, and then you write books, and then that's the opposite end of your barbell. It's a little bit risky. You don't have FU money, so you can't just say whatever you want. But I mean, you get to engage in something that is fulfilling and interesting and mind expanding. That is much better than just being like one of these fragilista policymakers that he describes that are, he has a section where he talks about trying to go to lunch, trying to go to lunch with somebody like this, somebody who's just so consumed with the work that they have to do, and that, they just have that dead, soulless look in their eyes. Somebody who lives in this position that where, if something bad were to happen, if there were any kind of volatility, they have almost all downside to this. Whereas these people who are in these positions, if like the French author, or like the taxi cab driver, they might feel like they don't have a solid ground, like they don't feel like they're as robust, I guess, just in terms of, what do you do for a living? Oh, I'm a policymaker. You're like, oh, wow, that guy's really made a name for himself. But in objective terms, this guy who's working as a taxi driver or who is working as a waiter and writing books on the side, they're more anti-fragile, and they have more opportunity for heroism, for development, and for, being exposed to stressors that will make them more intelligent, stronger, give them a better quality of life if they're able to utilize it properly.
Mm-hmm. Well, we've mentioned fragilistas numerous times so far, so I want to read what exactly is a fragilista. Taleb writes, in short, the fragilista, medical, economic, social planning, is one who makes you engage in policies and actions, all artificial, in which the benefits are small and visible, and the side effects potentially severe and invisible. So that's the short example. He writes, this is in a section where simple is more sophisticated. So he writes, a complex system, contrary to what people believe, does not require complicated systems and regulations and intricate policies. The simpler, the better. Complications lead to multiplicative chains of anticipated effects. Because of opacity, an intervention leads to unforeseen consequences, followed by apologies about the unforeseen aspect of the consequences, then to another intervention to correct the secondary effects, leading to an explosive series of branching unforeseen responses, each one worse than the preceding one. So this is Thomas Sowell. That's one of his points, too, that he comes back to again and again. So skipping ahead a bit on the subject of fragilistas, this is one example. The reader can get a hint of the central problem we face with top-down tampering with political systems or similar complex systems. For example, the fragilista mistakes the economy for a washing machine that needs monthly maintenance, or misconstrues the properties of your body for those of a compact disc player. Adam Smith himself made the analogy of the economy as a watch or clock that once set in motion continues on its own, but I am certain he did not quite think of matters in those terms, that he looked at the economy in terms of organisms but lacked a framework to express it. For Smith understood the opacity of complex systems as well as their interdependencies, since he developed the notion of the invisible hand. But alas, unlike Adam Smith, Plato did not quite get it. Promoting the well-known metaphor of the ship of state, he likens a state to a naval vessel, which, of course, requires the monitoring of a captain. He ultimately argues that only men fit to be captain of this ship are philosopher kings, benevolent men with absolute power who have access to the form of the good. And once in a while, one hears shouts of, "Who is governing us?" as if the world needs someone to govern it. So in that section, this is on the difference between antifragile and fragile systems, organic and inorganic systems, because organic systems are not machines. There's an important difference. So if you look at a human body, it's not just a washing machine. It's actually, because a washing machine is fragile, it needs maintenance. It breaks down over time. It doesn't get better with stress. It actually wears down with stress. You need to replace parts. The body is self-repairing, and it's anti-fragile in the sense that it actually gets better with minor stressors, certain types of stressors. So there's an important difference between the artificial things that we create, the machines that we create, and our bodies, which are much more than those types of machines that are the product of human creativity. But not just bodies, complex systems, any complex system. So there's culture, the economy, things like that. So he is it's clear from the quotes that we've read and what we've talked about that he's not in favor of these kind of top-down centralized approaches. And I just want to read one sentence and then get a bit into it. He writes, "For the economy to be anti-fragile and undergo what is called evolution, every single individual business must necessarily be fragile, exposed to breaking. Evolution needs organisms or their genes to die when supplanted by others in order to achieve improvement, or to avoid reproduction when they are not as fit as someone else." So this is it's kind of a central point that he makes about the economy and about businesses, is that the reason, for instance, that the restaurant economy will flourish is because of the vulnerability and the fragility of any individual restaurant business. And people who are familiar with the restaurant industry know this, is that restaurants close down, go bankrupt all the time. And it's kind of the foolhardy, courage or stupidity of the people that want to get into the restaurant business, thinking, oh, it won't happen to me. It's because of that you actually get a thriving restaurant business, is because you need people willing to take those risks, because a lot of them will fail, and you need those failures in order to actually innovate. That's the thing about innovation, is innovation needs failure. You need the stressor of failing in order to create that energy for innovation, that need for innovation. And if you take that out of the equation, let's say you have this thriving kind of restaurant business where all these restaurants are going out of business, and you get the few that are doing well, and then they go bust, and then it's this constantly churning machine, right? Where of rising and falling, and people getting thrown to the sharks, and others, getting great success, and that's kind of the symbol of the whole kind of an entire economy. But now let's say you have a central planner that comes in and says, okay, well, I'm going to fix this. I'm going to make sure that that these small businesses don't fail, and we're going to make it stable. So we're going to have one restaurant chain, right, that's going to dominate the entire restaurant scene. We're not going to allow any individual entrepreneurs to open up their own restaurant. And so you get this centralized, like he'd call it Soviet-style cafeteria system, which the best food you're going to get is going to be, crap. It's not going to be edible. It's just going to be boring. There's not going to be any innovation, because the innovation actually comes from that entrepreneurial spirit in that industry. And when you get the top-down centralized approach, it eliminates the possibility of that taking place. So when you have like these government-controlled monopolies, now there's no reason for innovation, and there's no motivation for innovation. So that's why everyone hates. If you look at government-controlled monopolies, they usually have piss poor products and services, and that's the reason, because there is no competition, because there's no impetus for anyone to actually there's no reason for anyone to come up with anything better, because they've got these cushy jobs, right? They've got their stability insured by the central authorities. So why do anything on top of that? There's no reason. And of course, it's a dumb reason. Ideally, everyone should be striving to do the best at all times, but that's just not the way that things actually work. If you actually take out that centralized system, if you take that out of the equation, then you're left with the restaurant industry as it actually should and naturally would operate, and that's a success. It's a success despite all of the individual failures, because you need those failures in order to have the system as a whole work, and to actually get the benefits of that system. And so I'm not familiar with all of his kind of theorizing on localism and kind of how things would be better structured, but I think one of the one of his concerns is to make it so that that system with its ups and downs and with its failures and successes can work as well as possible with as little of the downside as possible, but you can never get rid of the downside. Like you can never get rid of the idea that a business can fail, because that is essential. And it's the same thing everywhere on every different level, because there's this kind of fractal structure to the way things are. And if you look at the human body and just life in general, you have the life system, you have different species, you have different groups. You go down to the human level, you've got societies and cultures of humans, and then you've got small groups, villages of people, and then you've got a family unit, and then you've got your body, and your body is composed of individual cells, and the cells have their individual like proteins and different macromolecules and things inside of it. And on every level, there are stresses that cause this. Well, it's like cells die. He uses the example, for instance, of conditioning your body to poisons, for instance. So when you condition your body to poison, whatever is actually going on, if you're killing off the weak proteins in your cells, and then it's kind of like bacterial, what's it called? Bacterial resistance. The strong ones live on and reproduce in your body, and that makes your body stronger. Same thing like with your cells. If you're working out, you basically destroy and rip your muscle fibers so that they grow back and rebuild themselves on a stronger, at a stronger level. And it's this process that's going on all the time. And to deny that, or to try to fix it, to think to have the hubris that you can come in and fix something like nature that's so far out of your grasp is just the height of arrogance. And that's exactly what central planners everywhere are. They're just totally arrogant to think that they can succeed at this endeavor when it's completely impossible. And so it's just a waste of time. You shouldn't even go there. You should instead try to just understand and let things happen, and maybe try to slightly guide them, but don't try to rewrite the system, because it knows better than you do.
Well, he said a couple of things about entrepreneurship that I thought were quite interesting, because he says that he celebrates the individual's kind of attempt at trying to do something, and even suggests at one point that there should be this entrepreneurs recognition day, in light of the fact that people are putting themselves at risk, and that other people are in a position to learn from the failures of other people. And he says that is an anti-fragile kind of characteristic as well. Not that we want to see other people fail at things. And he's very kind of, you do get a sense that he's rooting for people. He's not a selfish individual. All of this is a kind of act of generosity on his part. It's to share what he's learning. At the same time, like you said, failure is definitely part of the equation, and failing at something in an attempt to be innovative and to take risks and to make things better are also part of the equation. So he moves on with this point at one point and gets into the idea that a lot of speculators, a lot of people who are in the markets, are looking at what a lot of other people are doing and doing exactly the opposite. And when I read that, I thought about this recent bit of news of this very well-known investor recently named Ray Dalio. So the alternative news sphere has been filled with articles of late about how Ray Dalio believes that there's going to be a very big recession, and sometime between now and March thinks that the stock market is going to dip by some untold percentage. So he's basically in the midst of all of this kind of news about the stock market doing so well and employment being so high and the economy's never been so great. He is betting $1.5 billion. I mean, really huge sums of money against what everybody in the mainstream news has been saying for the past year. And people are paying attention to him. So I thought about Ray Dalio, and then a few pages later, he talks about Ray Dalio as this anti-fragile predictor of a hedge fund who, for the past 20 years, is kind of this icon of financial success and prediction. So we can learn from the failures of others. It's a painful process if you have any amount of empathy for the individual who screwed up in some area, but it is also a teachable moment, a time where that lesson, if it isn't learned by the individual who's suffering the error, or the suckers and turkeys, as Taleb would say it, who are out there in the markets listening to all the bad advice and moving in one herd in one direction and doing pretty much all the same thing, you can benefit from in some way through that barbell idea that you talked about before, Corey. You can look at the riskier side of investment or doing things with your time and kind of balance it out with the much more paranoid and conservative and well-known things that will leave you at least stable and robust and able to withstand any kind of disappointments. But there is a kind of an approach to all of this that he talks about, and I was going to read this little bit here. He says that you can control fragility a lot more than you think. So let us refine in 3 points. Since detecting antifragility, or actually smelling it, as Fat Tony will show us in the next few chapters. Fat Tony is this guy who it's Taleb's Brooklyn friend, the guy who's probably kind of connected to the mob. He hangs around all day. He eats a lot. He meets with people. He gets information. He makes investments, and he literally smells, the fragility in people. He sniffs them out. He sees what they're made of, what their character is, what their character consists of, what their vulnerabilities are. And you can look at it in one of two ways. You can look at it as, well, the guy is somewhat of a predator, or you can look at it as someone who is a student of nature, of character, of his environment, of people who are doing things around him, and the success and relative failures of the choices that they make. So getting back to that, he says, since detecting antifragility, or actually smelling it, as Fat Tony will show us in the next few chapters, is easier, much easier than prediction and understanding the dynamics of events, the entire mission reduces to the central principle of what to do to minimize harm and maximize gain from forecasting errors. That is, to have things that don't fall apart or even benefit when we make a mistake. We do not want to change the world for now. Leave that to the Soviet Harvard utopists and other fragilistas. We should first make things more robust to defects and forecast errors, or even exploit these errors, making lemonade out of the lemons. As for the lemonade, it looks as if history is in the business of making it out of lemons. Antifragility is necessarily how things move forward under the mother of all stressors, called time. Further, after the occurrence of an event, we need to switch the blame from the inability to see an event coming, say a tsunami, an Arabo-Semitic spring or similar riots, an earthquake, a war, or a financial crisis, to the failure to understand antifragility, namely, quote, why did we build something so fragile to these types of events, end quote. Not seeing a tsunami or an economic event coming is excusable. Building something fragile to them is not. So this is getting back to the earlier point you were making, Corey, which is that we don't have to have the exact time and date and specific black swan that's going to come and wreck things, or at least make things more challenging. But we can anticipate the vulnerability in something that we're responsible for, that we have some control of, that we can empower ourselves to make stronger, to add redundancy to, which is a word and a term that he uses at one point. Redundancy is good, reinforcing something. Instead of having one flashlight in your house in the event of a blackout, have 3 flashlights. Have one in each room. Instead of having a store of food of only one type in one place, have food in 2 or 3 different caches of different varieties, and some you can even barter or exchange with. Just to give an analogy, so redundancy is another big kind of anti-fragile concept, something that reinforces the strength of an anticipated failure or weakness.
No, I think there's just a number of really good points to touch on there. One thing that I'm thinking of, I remember he was writing about the era that we're living in, right? Because we're definitely in this kind of a strange moment in history. A lot of fragilistas have been planning, and a lot of interventions. We kind of live in a powder keg. A lot of people are made fragile by pharmaceuticals, by drugs. A lot of problems in the economy are just keep kind of being put on the back burner. And like the analogy that he uses of fire management, if you stop the small debris from being burned up in small brush fires, then you're just piling up more and more debris, and then when the fire does come, it's going to be a massive black swan event. And we definitely, it seems like we are in an age of that level of fragility, just in terms of people's psychology and our physiology, just taking pill after pill for every sort of ailment, and all of this, fake food made by interventionists, naive interventionists who thought that they could genetically modify the food supply and genetically modify everything, and there would be no adverse effects. We could tell nature to do it better than she wants to do it. And I think overall, I would highly recommend reading this book, and in fact, probably reading the entire series. I think that we should probably do a show on every one of his books, because it's he's a very unique thinker, and he has a lot of heuristics and a lot of tools that we can't really cover just in one show. And just reading the book, you're going to be overwhelmed, if you haven't read it already, by the sheer number of tools and heuristics and ways of thinking about situations, and just little embellishments that he puts on everyday situations that you can use to enhance the options that you have in your own life. He's all about options. The more options that you have, the more anti-fragile you have, because say this doesn't work, boom, I've got this option and that. And then he also has, he speaks of them in financial ways too. But in that sense, I was wondering, did you guys have anything else that you wanted to say about the book here?
Just one overall point to relate it to some previous shows, that Taleb really did a service with kind of coming up with this word and this concept to be able to kind of give the name to something that we've all known on some level exists, but now that we have the name for it, we can do more with it. Understand it better and integrate it more into our the part of our lives that we use our thinking for, as opposed to just doing. Mm-hmm. And it relates back to to multiple of our shows, but in I think the most the one that sticks out for me is just the Dabrowski's theory of positive disintegration, which is premised on this idea that that there is a something more in a lot of humans, more than resiliency, there's something about the shocks and the stresses of, in this case, of what's often considered mental illness. So extreme neuroses and psychoneuroses, as Dabrowski calls it, that can tear a person down, but out of which something stronger and greater and on a completely different level can emerge. Like a phoenix, but actually more than a phoenix, because he uses the example of the phoenix. The phoenix just comes back as a phoenix over and over. Mm-hmm. More like a positive hydra, mm-hmm. Where something is actually transformed into something higher and greater, and that there's actually a whole other level of this process and this concept that goes on that people are unaware of, on the level of psychological growth that kind of gets into the deepest aspects of what religions hint at and present as a possibility. That there is something about like human nature and the human spirit that has this anti-fragility built into it, that can lead to evolution on a scale that is unacknowledged and unforeseen and invisible to most people at most times. But it's something there. It's something within human nature, and I think that's something that for those to whom that is kind of a call and has some resonance, that is an idea to be pursued and put into practice in one's life. And we'll get into that in other shows.
Well, yeah, that's interesting. You bring up the Hydra and the Phoenix, because I love these books, and I just want to see. I would love to see something a little bit more explicitly like mythological. You know what I'm saying? Because that's where this kind of fits in my mind. He's kind of taking the world of action and he's describing it and kind of breaking it down, and he's getting frustrated by academics who. It's interesting though, but he's like, they're allergic to the idea of anti-fragility. Clearly Dabrowski probably ran into that throughout his entire career as a psychologist, and still the whole idea, the theory of positive disintegration, didn't really take on. Now we have post-traumatic growth, but mm-hmm. that's slightly. It's in similar lines.
Yeah,
it's related, but that's still kind of its own niche little field. But anti-fragility is this concept that you can, add to your lexicon, and then you can slot all these other different things into it. So it's kind of the mother idea, the mother concept of what benefits from volatility. And it's nice to be, he's got these very simple ways to see if you measure up, in different areas of your life. Are you a fragilista here, or are you, anti-fragile there? But other than that, that's it for this week. We hope that you tune in next time. And if you like this show, please subscribe, hit like, and have a great week, everyone. Bye-bye.
Bye, everyone.
See you later.